In 1983, Willie Nelson and Merle Haggard released a song called Pancho and Lefty. It went to #1 on the country charts. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It became one of the most celebrated country songs of its generation. The man who wrote it was living in a tin-roofed shack in rural Tennessee at the time, with no heat, no plumbing, and no telephone. His name was Townes Van Zandt. And while Willie Nelson was collecting royalties, Townes was playing bars for 50 people and sleeping on the floors of friends' houses. Earle once said, "Townes Van Zandt is the best songwriter in the world, and I'll stand on Bob Dylan's coffee table in my cowboy boots and tell him that." Bob Dylan lives comfortably in a beachfront home in Malibu. Townes Van Zandt died with his ex-wife performing CPR on his body. This is his story. John Townes Van Zandt was born on the 7th of March, 1944 in Fort Worth, Texas. He was not born into poverty. He was born into one of the most prominent families in Texas, a family whose ancestors had helped found Fort Worth, whose name had been given to an entire county, whose wealth came from oil and cattle and law. His father was a corporate lawyer. His family moved him between Fort Worth, Midland, Colorado, and Montana during his childhood, following the requirements of his father's career. At Christmas in 1956, when Townes was 12 years old, his father gave him a guitar. He never put it down. As a teenager, Townes began to struggle with his mental health. He was diagnosed with manic depression, and in a decision that would cast a shadow over everything that followed, his family agreed to have him treated with insulin shock therapy, a practice that would later be widely discredited and abandoned. The treatment erased much of his long-term memory. It took away his childhood. He would spend the rest of his life without reliable access to who he had been before his 20s, a man whose past had been partially removed, who carried his songs in his memory but could barely remember his own history. He dropped out of the University of Colorado in the early 1960s and drove to Houston to become a musician. His family had been preparing him for the Texas governorship. He chose dive bars instead. Between 1968 and 1973, Townes Van Zandt recorded 6 studio albums. He wrote the songs that would define his legacy during this period. Pancho and Lefty, If I Needed You, Tecumseh Valley, To Live Is to Fly, Waitin' Around to Die. They were unlike anything else being written at the time. Country music in the early 1970s was dominated by the polished Nashville sound, orchestrated, smooth, commercial. Townes was writing something else entirely. Songs that felt like they had always existed, that were so true they seemed less composed than discovered. Earle would later say, "There had never been a songwriter in America who understood the weight of a single word the way Townes did." But the record sold almost nothing. Townes played small venues, often to crowds of fewer than 50 people. He lived in cheap motel rooms and borrowed floors, and for years in the 1970s, in a tin-roofed shack outside Nashville with no heat, no running water, and no telephone. Other artists began to record his songs. Emmylou Harris took If I Needed You to #3 on the country charts in 1981. But the royalties that reached Townes were modest. He kept playing the bars, he kept writing, he kept drinking. He once said, "I'm going to be a great songwriter, or I'm going to be a dead songwriter. Those are my only 2 options." He said this without self-pity, as if he were simply describing the weather. In 1972, Townes Van Zandt recorded Pancho and Lefty for his album The Late Great Townes Van Zandt, a title he had chosen himself with characteristic black humor As if announcing his own obituary, the song went unnoticed. The album did not chart. The record label barely promoted it. Townes moved on. In 1977, Emmylou Harris recorded it for her album Luxury Liner. Willie Nelson heard it. He didn't forget it. In 1983, Nelson recorded Pancho and Lefty as a duet with Merle, Haggard. When Nelson asked Townes what the song was about, Townes said he didn't know. He had written it in one sitting, he said, and it felt less like something he had composed than something that had passed through him. The Nelson and Haggard version went to #1. It stayed on the charts for months. It entered the Grammy Hall of Fame. The song has been downloaded hundreds of thousands of times since digital music made such things countable. Townes Van Zandt appeared briefly in the music video, a cameo in a song he had written in a version he had not made, celebrating a success that belonged to someone else. By most accounts, he received very little money from it. The publishing arrangements that governed his early recordings were not generous to him. He continued to live the way he had always lived. In the 1990s, Townes Van Zandt began to be recognized by a younger generation of musicians and critics who understood what he had done. He played larger venues. He made a handful of television appearances. He was in the process of recording a new album for a major label, his first, when he fell and injured his hip in late 1996. He had surgery. The surgery did not go well. On the morning of January the 1st, 1997, Townes Van Zandt died of cardiac arrest at his home in Smyrna, Tennessee. He was 52 years old. He died on New Year's Day, the same date 44 years later, as the death of his idol, Hank Williams. He left behind a shoebox full of unreleased poems and lyrics, with a note asking that a friend set them to music. He left behind 3 children who had grown up largely without him because the road and the whiskey and the music had taken most of what he had to give. He left behind the songs. Pancho and Lefty, If I Needed You, To Live Is to Fly, songs that Bob Dylan has performed, that Robert Plant has recorded, that Steve Earle called the greatest body of work in American music. He left behind, somewhere in the air over Texas, the question of what he might have become if anyone had noticed while he was still alive to see it. If this story moved you, subscribe. There are more of them, and not one of them ordinary.